PowerPoint room var.
Молодец, я соленый огурец.
Вкусная?
Есть черпи, подарим окей.
In Madrid?
Is this Hovhannisyan?
Nicht besser, nicht besser. Eine Lomes gegessen.
Hovhannisyan'ı yiyeceksiniz. Ben şarkı translation.
Զորո, այս ինչ ես արել, որ բաները չի երևում։
Հետո ես քեզ զանգեցի։
Որի գրած բաները։ Մեն ինչ սխում։ Մեն ինչ է դան։
Communication ինչ։ Communication.
I know that you have said.
Yes. I think that it's mostly for if it goes. I was witnessing and you told me it's very close.
So the lesser
Because the proposal that is 4 pages. See, it's based on you can get it you tell me what. That's all I said there, but it's detailed.
giving lectures.
I wish faster. Because I'm sure that find
Co tam to są?
No, you're gonna need it.
It's here jokes. It's based on
Good evening. I'm the president of AUA, and I welcome you all here. A few things before I start. This event, as well as the entire series, are being live streamed here by Armenian Visual College. They're also being recorded by our communications people. Those who are viewing through live streaming, they can participate in the questions and answers. So if questions are asked, they we will be hearing somehow, I don't know exactly how, but we will be able to respond to those questions. Also, the videos of these lectures will be on our social media and website, and so those who unfortunately will be missing partly because of the traffic conditions, very difficult traffic conditions, they can view this first lecture on the website, and then the next two lectures will also be on the website. Also, the lectures are being translated into Armenian. Ուրեմն մենք անմիջական թարգմանություն կա հայերենի, եւ եթե պետք ունեք հայերենով լսելու, այնտեղ ականջակալեր կան, որտեղ են դեպի հետևի մասում կարող եք ստանալ ականջակալեր, որպեսզի կարողանաք լսել հայերենով, եթե պետք է դա։ Ուրեմն դասախոսությունը եւ հարցոպատասխանը մեծ մասամբ լինելու են հայերենի, երևի կարելի է հարցեր լինեն հայերենով։ This year marks the centennial of the First Armenian Republic. Established on May 28, 1918, the First Republic laid the grounds for the Second Republic during the Soviet years, and now the Third Republic as of September 21, 1991. Incidentally, that date is also the date of opening of this university. As a university, the best way for us to commemorate this anniversary is to provide a scholarly examination of its history and significance. There is no scholar in this world who is more qualified to speak about this subject than Professor Richard Hovhannisyan. His 4 volumes on the history of the First Republic, which are now translated in Armenian and Russian, are the definitive works on the subject. He has been a sought-after speaker for many years, but this year he is engaged in numerous commemorative events throughout the world. I think we are fortunate to have him this week for this series of lectures. I would like to point out that his 4 volumes in the First Republic, as well as his other published books, are available in our library in a large collection donated by Professor Hovhannisyan himself. I'm very grateful to the Armenian Benevolent Union, represented here by the President of AGBU Armenia, Vasken Yawobian, for sponsoring this lecture series, and so I want to publicly acknowledge the sponsorship, and also AVC, that is doing the live streaming, is also one of the projects that AGBU has started in Armenia. So I'm very thankful. Richard Hovhannisyan is the first holder of the Armenian Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of California, Los Angeles, better known as UCLA. He's President's Fellow at Chapman University and Adjunct Professor of History at the University of Southern California to work with the Shoah Foundation on Armenian survivor testimonies. A native of California, he received his BA and MA in History from the University of California at Berkeley and his PhD in History from UCLA. A member of the UCLA faculty since the 1960s, he organized both the undergraduate and graduate programs in Armenian history and served as the Associate Director of UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies for 20 years. One could call him as the father of Armenian studies in the United States. Professor Hovhannisyan is a Guggenheim Fellow and has received many honors for his scholarship, civic activities, and support of individual and collective human rights, including medals and encyclicals for His Holiness Karakin I and Karakin II of Holy See of Echmiadzin, and from His Holiness Karakin II and Aram I of the Great House of Cilicia. He's a founder and 6-time president of the Society for Armenian Studies and has given more Richard Hovhannisyan represented the state of California on the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education for 15 years and has served as a consultant to the California State Board of Education, authoring the chapter on the Armenian genocide in the state's Social Studies Model Curriculum on Human Rights and Genocide. In 1990, he was elected to the Armenian Academy of Sciences, becoming the first social science scientist living abroad to be so honored. As I mentioned, Professor Hovhannisyan has published more than 30 books, including 4 volumes on the First Republic, which are not translated into Armenian Russian, 6 volumes on the Armenian genocide, and 14 volumes on historic Armenian cities and provinces in the Ottoman Empire. Also, as I mentioned, these volumes are all available in our library, and I hope that you will have a chance to view them and hopefully borrow them. Our library is open to the public in general. So it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Hovhannisyan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dergurarian, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I know our numbers are a bit low today, but I'm glad on the other hand that we have in our streets the ability to have some civil disobedience and civil protest, which is a hallmark of aspiring democracies, and I hope we're moving in that direction. I want to thank Dr. Dergurarian and the American University of Armenia, the Armenian General Benevolent Union, for the invitation to be here and to share some of my thoughts on this important anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Republic of Armenia. And I thought first I'll talk a bit about myself. Aside from the introduction, I was, let me just see if I can do this properly. Okay. I was born in California more than 8 decades ago. I'm the first generation to be born from the survivors who managed to make it to America. My father and my mother both were born in historic Armenia in the province of Kharpet. My father's family was entirely annihilated. His mother, his brother, his father, all were later rescued by Near East Relief and arrived in America. But my father survived just by chance. And in this book, Family of Shadows, written by Garin Hovhannisyan, is my father's story. It begins with my father's story, a story that I didn't know most of my life because, like many other survivors, Kaspar did not speak about all of the trauma and trouble that he went through, and only in the last year of his life did we learn that he was taken away from the death caravans that were going toward the deserts by Kurdish tribesmen. They took him away because he was a boy of 12 or 13 years of age and took him away to work slave labor as a shepherd boy and was very badly treated by these particular family of Kurds for 3 years. And then in 1917, that is the 3rd year after the beginning of the genocide, somehow there was like an underground kind of information that was passed from one Armenian boy who was a slave to another Armenian boy, that they had heard that Antranik, the famous partisan leader Antranik, with his Gamavors, volunteers, had come to Erzurum and then had gotten all the way, with some of his people, had gotten all the way to Erzincan. And Erzincan, or Erzincan as it's now known, is a neighboring district Harpert. And so they ran away from their masters at night and were helped by the Alawi Kurds of Dersim, which is a district between Harpert and Erzincan. Were able to get there, and a boy of 16 picked up a gun and a rifle and a bayonet, never having touched one before, and suddenly became a soldier himself, and somehow went through difficulties getting into the Caucasus. You know that after the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Russian armies withdrew from the occupied portions of Turkey. The Armenians also had to flee at that time, and my father ended up in Husayn-Govgas in the North Caucasus. And somehow he then found himself in 1919, early 1920, in Bolis in Constantinople, and he had a very distant relative, not so distant, a relative in California, who sent the $50 that was necessary for him to take the ship to come to America. And when he came to America, they asked him what his name was, and he didn't give our family name, which was different, but he gave his father's first name, which was Hovhannisyan, in honor of his father, who was taken away as a soldier by the Turkish authorities.
Work today in the unarmed labor battalions, and so we became Hovhannisyan only in 1920 as a result of my father wanting to remember his own father, and spent his life rebuilding what he could. Came to California, bought a small farm on which I grew up, and ultimately prospered, like most of the Armenian survivors were able to do. And like many others, he didn't speak. Some spoke incessantly about what occurred, especially women who spoke continuously, were traumatized all their life. And then there were others like my father who suppressed it and didn't want to talk about it. And we didn't, as I say, we didn't know until the very late times in his life what he had been through. I, as a youngster, was not comfortable being an Armenian. I grew up in America in a very nationalistic, the Armenian word is Odar Adyats, Yergirer Amerikan, and we, who were the first generation born there, were not secure in who we were. Our parents spoke broken English, they were not highly educated, they were peasant people, and we wanted to become accepted by the Americans. And so it took me some years to feel comfortable with being an Armenian. It took some effort, but I'm glad that ultimately I found the road to do that, partly because of people whom I met along the way, and I always had this dream of knowing that there had been an Armenian state in 1918. I didn't know much about it, but I was a dreamer, and I dreamed about a free and independent Armenia. I dreamed, and I loved politics, so I dreamed about myself being a representative of Armenia in the United Nations and other such romantic ideas. But it was those romantic ideas that brought me to the history of the First Armenian Republic. In America especially, this republic was very controversial. There were sides drawn. The Armenian flag was either Gbashdein, Gam Gadein. It became a symbol of partisanship and of political parties. Unfortunately, lost in mythology. People really didn't know the history of the republic, and yet they drew sides, and it was not a happy time for the Armenian American community. But still, I was drawn to the idea of Armenian independence. I was hurt by the fact that I didn't find much about Armenia in history books. Like all of us, and in the West at least, when we got a book on the Middle East or on anything, we looked in the index, the first thing, to look for the word Armenia. And if we didn't find it, we were disappointed, and that happened a lot. It happened a lot. And so as I grew older and became more comfortable with my Armenianism, I know that I wanted to go into the history. I always loved history, and I thought, wouldn't it be good if I could study Armenian history? But I didn't know Armenian. I could speak Mercharperti Parparov Hosaink, but I couldn't speak Armenian, and I couldn't certainly read Armenian. And if I wanted to do Armenian history, I would have to be able to read it. And it was at that time that one of the people whom I met was the last prime minister of the First Armenian Republic, whose name was Hovhannisyan. You know. A no-choice situation in which the independent Armenia, at the end of 1920, gave way to save whatever was left, that is what we have today, by allowing the Red Army to enter into Armenia and declaring Armenia to become a socialist Soviet, as it was then called, Socialist Soviet Armenian Republic. Well, the last prime minister, again, I romanticized about him. We had this great awe of a person who had been the prime minister. His name was, as I said, Simon Hovhannisyan. And after I had graduated from the University of California, I was already 22 because I had graduated and done another year to become a teacher, teaching credential. He met me and he saw some potential in me, I suppose. I don't know what he saw, but he saw something. And he suggested that I now travel to Beirut, because in those years it was, in Soviet Armenian time, American students didn't come here to Yerevan to study. They had to go somewhere to learn Armenian. And so the main center of Armenian life was Beirut. And so I traveled across the ocean on ship, to the surprise of my parents and everyone else, because very few people traveled in that direction. And I spent 9 months in Beirut, which are the most important months of my life, probably, because I was able to learn the Armenian language, living among the Armenian people of Lebanon, and learning to read and write. However difficult that was for me. And this is Beirut, the harbor of Beirut, where I went. And now this is the school. It's known as the Gemaran. It doesn't exist anymore because of the Lebanese Civil War. That is, this old building is no longer there. And here's a picture of that last prime minister, whose name was Hovhannisyan. And if you will, the tool to be able to return to America and spend my life studying Armenian history, first at the University of California at Berkeley, and then doing a PhD dissertation on an Armenian subject at the UCLA, at the University of California, Los Angeles. Now, this was at a time when there were no Armenian studies courses anywhere in America. I became a professor of Armenian history without ever in my life having taken a course in Armenian history, because there were no courses in Armenian history. We created them. I and a number, 4 or 5 other individuals, Fortunately, in the 1950s, by the 1950s, where there became a greater interest in international studies, partly because of the Cold War, and greater interest in them, I was able to do my dissertation on an Armenian subject, and then ultimately, in the early 1960s, to become a pioneer in teaching Armenian history at a university level, along with 2 or 3 other individuals in America who were at the right place at the right time to be able to do that. I spent, as Dr. Derguregan pointed out, much of my investigating the partisanship, out of the mythology, out of the extreme love and extreme hatred, and to put it into historical perspective, with its good and with its bad, with its problems and with its achievements. And what I thought was going to be easy to write a history of Vershavis. It was only 2.5-year history. It should not have taken so long to write the history of 2.5 years. And I thought I would do it as a dissertation, but as it ended up, it took me 30 years to write these volumes on the history, because with my wife Vartiter, as we started to examine the sources, the archival sources, in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, and in other countries, we found that the material relating to the Armenian Republic was enormous. Enormous. Just in the single archive of Avedi Saharonyan, who was a representative of the Armenian Republic in Paris after World War I, in his single archive, that is that Republic delegation archive, there is so much material on Karabakh alone that it figures in the thousands of pages just on Karabakh. And for a while I thought I'd write my dissertation on the Karabakh quarrel. And I never thought, by the way, in the 30 years that I was writing this history of the First Armenian Republic, that all of these issues about which I wrote in detail would become live issues once again. That Karabakh would again become a live issue and not just a historical issue. And that all these other issues of Shurchapagum being blockaded, of dealing with not so reliable neighbors, with economic collapse within the country after independence, with the struggle to create the framework of a democratic institution and democratic institutions in this small country would become live issues again, and they did. And so it's not, you may be rather surprised if you read these 4 volumes and go into the chapters on Karabakh alone. So much will be familiar to you because it's all came alive again after 1988, and I had no idea that that was going to be the case. So this is my fundamental հիմնական աշխատանքը Հայաստանի Հանրապետության պատմությունը եղած է ինձ համար. Again, I tried to be as balanced as I could. It's not easy. No historian can be fully objective. History is not a precise science. History is interpretation. It's bringing together the facts and trying to understand the facts. And this is what I've tried to do, and tried to be as fair as I can without losing my sympathy for the ideal of independence. I mean, when I write about Karabakh, some people think that, oh, this is very bad that you are saying what the Azerbaijani claims are to Karabakh. But no, we have to know what the Azerbaijanis are claiming and why they are claiming it. Or when it comes to Lori or Akhokalak, what are the conflicting claims between the Armenians and the Georgians, and what are the historical roots for those claims? This is what we have to do. And then we can make our own interpretation eventually of what we think, but you need to be as balanced. And also looking at the internal life of Armenia, we can't just present it as being a rosy, you know, as in my childhood image of Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, no, it wasn't that way. It was a struggle. There was a lot of difficulty, famine, and loss of life to disease, not because of anything that the Armenians did, but because of the fact that they had been in a war zone for more than 4 years, that all their young people in Russian Armenia had been drafted into the Russian army and taken away, that the economy in Yerevan gubernia had already fallen to a very low level, that is, loss of agricultural income. And Armenia, even in the best of times, this area of Armenia, which was the least productive part of historic Armenia, the least productive part of historic Armenia is where we are today. The rich lands of Armenia lie on the other side of the border. And on this area of Yerevan had always to import grain from Russia, from South Russia, to live, because it could not feed its own people sufficiently in this small area. And suddenly you're cut off from those supplies by a civil war in Russia. You're pushed and squeezed because of Turkish invasions from the West. You've been betrayed, in your mind at least, by Soviet Russia, which declares the right of self-determination to the Armenian people and so forth on the one hand, but on the other hand gets out of World War I by making a treaty with Germany and Turkey and giving up all of Western Armenia, which the Russian armies had occupied in World War I. The Russian armies, along with the Armenian volunteer detachments, 6 volunteer detachments with Antranik and Dro and Keri and Hamazbast and others, had gotten all the way to Erzurum and Erzincan, and suddenly in the beginning of 1917, when the Russian Revolution gives new life to Turkey. Turkey was defeated. Turkey was at an end in 1917. It was just waiting for the spring, for the new offensive to open up the snowbound Armenian plateaus so that the end of Turkey would be brought. But again, the Russian revolutions, as in many other occasions, saved the Ottoman Empire, saved Turkey from immediate defeat. And instead, when the communists took over in November of 1917, and Lenin decided we'll have peace at any price. Peace at any price. And peace at any price meant giving away the Ukraine, half of the Ukraine, to Germany. It meant giving away Batmagan, Hayastan to Turkey, but not only Batmagan, historic Armenia, to Turkey, but also Kars and Ardahan to Turkey. And not only that, by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. And so the Turkish armies took advantage of this upheaval in Russia and the civil war between whites and reds, and made, first of all, beginning in the spring of 1918, attacked to take over all of historic Armenia. And the Armenian refugees, Western Armenian refugees who had come to Yerevan and Echmiadzin in 1915 and 1916, many of them returned when the Russian armies had taken over these regions. They returned to Garin, to Erzurum, and to Van. And now a second time in 1918, they have to retreat one more time. I mean, the misery of the Armenian people. And they're concentrating in this little, terribly not underpopulated, but lack of supplies in this little area that we call Armenia today, packing in 300,000, 400,000 Western Armenian refugees who make life for the Devatsi Armenians, for the local Armenians, miserable, and who come to hate each other as people who are living off this land which we don't have enough for ourselves, and so the conflict between Eastern Armenian and Western Armenian, Devatsi and Kaftagan, Pakistagan is immediate in this region. So it's under those circumstances that we have to understand what was happening and to present this in a way that we can comprehend why there was a crisis and why it was that the leadership of the Armenian people was reluctant in 1918 to declare Armenian independence under those circumstances, with a country without resources and a country without infrastructure, because the Armenian leadership was in Tiflis, not in Yerevan. They were in Tiflis. The Armenian Askarin Khorur, the Armenian National Council, made up of the Dashaktuchun, of the Zhourtagan, Ramgavar, or Popular People's Party, the Socialist Democrats, the Socialist Revolutionaries. Their centers were in Tiflis. The Armenian economic, cultural, political center was not Yerevan at all. Yerevan was a sleepy, sleepy oriental town with maybe 25, 30,000 people, and a significant percentage of those people were not even Armenians. But it was Tiflis that was the Armenian center, and suddenly the Armenians are to find themselves in a situation where their beloved capital, Tiflis, cultural and economic and political, is no longer their capital. Because in 1918, the Georgians are going to declare independence and reclaim the capital city, their historic capital city, as they should. Well, let me just quickly tell you that after writing 30 years, I published my last volumes in 1996. I started in 1967 with Armenia on the Road to Independence. Up until the last two volumes, I had to rely on archives from around the world, except for the Armenian archives. The Armenian National Archives were not available to me. They were closed. They were closed because it was Soviet times, and I was a foreign scholar, an American scholar, and there was no access for me, even though the Soviet Armenian historians and scholars encouraged me a great deal. And on the side and secretly were always telling me, you were doing that which we wish we could do, but we're not able to do. But in the last two volumes, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, in the period of late Soviet and early independent period, I did have access to, for the last two volumes, after I had actually written them. And I was glad to see that I had interpreted as I would have interpreted if I had had access. In other words, they did not add anything that would have changed my interpretation of the historic Republic of Armenia. It gave me some additional detail which I may not have had, but enhanced the detail, but didn't change anything. You've seen that, as mentioned, it's been a long and difficult years in translating the 4 volumes to Armenian and to the Armenian used here, that is in the reformed orthography, Uvakuruchun. And the difficulties were not only because of translation. I had to compare with the translators. They're very good translators, but sometimes they don't understand the nuances of the vocabulary. And so you have to be sure that they understand what you were trying to say. And then also, the language in Armenia has changed a great deal. And as you know, much of the vocabulary are not the good Armenian words, but have become international words. why should I use the word unikal? What does unikal mean? Yurahaduk. Inchu planavorel, yevochte zerakarel. And so I had to fight in order to insist that we use the Armenian word, even though I'm told and warned, merjourti chi haskanar. Se tok chi haskanan tok sorvin. And so I became a little stubborn on that, and I'm glad that finally, last year, through the Academy of Sciences here, the support of the Academy of Sciences, these 4 volumes became available, and they're now available in bookstores, I think, somewhere in Yerevan. And then one volume done with Gayane Makhmurian was doing a volume in Russian on the foreign policy of the First Republic, and that is for the Russian readers especially. After that, I've done the 6 volumes on the Armenian genocide. I don't like genocide studies. I'm not a genocide historian, but I was pushed into this field by denial of the Armenian genocide and published these. And the final thing that I'm proud of now is starting in around 2000, I started a series of conferences at UCLA in which we focused on the historic Armenian provinces and cities and communities of the Ottoman Empire, starting with Van, Bitlis, Harpert, Erzurum, Sepastya, Dikranagerd, Giligya, Pontos, Bolis, Kars and Ani, Izmir, Gesaria, Cappadocia, Pokerasia, Verchina in 2016, and the Armenian communities of basically of Kesab and Musadag. And so in the English language we now have available these 14 volumes for non-Armenian readers and also Armenian readers who don't have access to easily access to knowing a little bit. These are not comprehensive volumes, but they tell us a little bit about each of these areas where the Armenians were, and I think we have most of the volumes in the AUA library today. This is the map of historic Armenia, or the 6 vilayets. In the 19th century, the Armenian question became an international issue of how to bring to the Armenian Christians in the Ottoman Empire their desired achievement of security of life and property. Security and life and property was the main goal of the Armenian people, reformers in the 19th century. It was not independence. Armenians did not ask for independence in the 19th century. Perhaps because Armenian situation was very complicated. Armenians had now become a minority in many areas of what had once been historic Armenia. And outside of this area of the 6 provinces, there were well over 1 million Armenians living in other areas of the Ottoman Empire, in Giligya, in Cilicia, in Gesaria, in Western Asia Minor, in Bolis, Constantinople, Istanbul, had more Armenians living there than in any other city in the Ottoman Empire, just like Tiflis was not a part of Armenia, but had more Armenians and was a cultural, economic, political center of the Armenians of the Russian Empire. So too Constantinople was the economic, intellectual, literary center, and economic center of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. So the Armenians were scattered all over. And it may not be surprising, therefore, that the Armenian reformers of the 19th century, who were begging for change, were not asking for independent Armenia, but were asking for a secure land, a secure life for themselves and their property. And as you well know, in these eastern provinces in particular, life was very, very dangerous because of the Kurdish tribesmen who lived among the Armenians, who raided the Armenians every year. I mean, the Armenians worked all year. Kashkadein ambosh darin, perke gahasner ev havasik Kardagan Rosachumpur Gabatnain Katalanin Island. So it was this kind of insecurity and taking away the young girls and so forth. So the Armenian question was one of security of life and property, and ultimately became also one of local self-government. We want to have the right to have in our own district the right to have a local government, to have some Armenian policemen, to have some Armenian administrators in our own district. This was largely what the Armenian question had been. During World War I, beginning in 1914, the Russian imperial authorities, who had not been sympathetic to Armenian demands in Turkey, were not sympathetic to them because the Armenians could turn around and ask for the same thing in the Russian Empire. They could ask for the same thing here in Yerevan, and so forth. So the imperial governments don't like to give people many rights. Dictatorships like to keep control with a police state. That should be obvious. And so the Russians were clever under Tsar Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar, and they showed themselves to be sympathetic to Armenian claims. And they allowed the Catholicos, Catholicos Georg V, to appoint Boaz Nubar Pasha as his representative in Paris to represent the Armenian cause to the European powers. And they allowed the Bureau of the Armenian leadership in Tiflis to organize Armenian volunteer battalions, or Kunder, Gamaboragan Kunder, of which there were 6 organized. They were not huge in number, or in number of people joining, but a few thousand Armenians entered into the Armenian volunteer units as part of the Russian war effort to occupy these provinces that had been the center of the Armenian liberation movement. The Armenian political parties, starting with the Armenakan in Van, which was one of the predecessors to the current Ramgavar party, the Tashakirchun, organized in Tiflis in 1890, the Hanshagian party in Geneva even before that in 1887. The focus of their liberation struggle was this area that you see here. It was not really focused on Yerevan. The oppression of the Armenians in the Russian Empire was considered less intense. And they didn't want to have a struggle on 2 fronts. I mean, you choose your enemy. And for them, their enemy were the Turks, the Turkish government, and not the Tsar, even though the Tsar was not a good person. As you know, he had confiscated the properties of the Armenian church. They had become behind the struggle and the fights between Armenians and Muslims in what we call the Armeno-Tatar clashes in 1905 and 1907. So the Tsarist people were not very good. They were not good. But here they are in 1914 saying to the Armenians, we're with you. And if we win this war against Turkey, we will ensure that you will have a secure national future under our protection. And the Armenians fell for it. Maybe they shouldn't have fallen for that line, but it was very attractive. And as you probably know, the Armenians did send their volunteer units all the way to Erzurum and to Van to liberate them then. And it was hopeful. It was hopeful. Many of the Armenian refugees from 1915 who had come to Echmiadzin and so forth, you know the story of the thousands of Vanetsis and others, the story of Arshil Gorky and his family. These people returned to Van, they returned to Garin, but in 1918, because of the situation with the Russian armies withdrawing or fleeing from the area under the urging of Lenin to leave the front, not only this front, but all the fronts, the German front, the Austrian front, and the Turkish front, Armenia was in a serious political turmoil. Andranik, of course, well-known, probably the most well-known Armenian military figure in modern Armenian history, much beloved by the Armenian people, and the second, Ndro Ganayan, again a strong military leader whom I met once in 1956 in Beirut, where he lived his last years. These were people who led the Armenian volunteer detachments under the auspices of the Russian army, and were bitterly disappointed, ultimately, when they were abandoned and had to withdraw from Western Armenia and into Eastern Armenia, or the current region. This brings us to 1918. And I don't have a watch, so give me a signal, please.
7:30.
All right. Just do this to me, okay? Bring us to 1918. Caucasus in turmoil as well. The Caucasians, however much they had a dissatisfaction with the Russian regime, imperial regime, there was nonetheless security and protection with that Russian armies nearby. When they all withdrew in 1918 from this region, and the Turkish armies, with their treaty with Soviet Russia, reclaimed these 6 provinces, or part of the 6 provinces that had been occupied by Russia, and then entered into Kars and Ardahan. The Armenians were in a panic situation, and they sought the support of their fellow Caucasian people, the Georgians to the north, and the Muslims to the east and to the south. The leadership of the Georgians and the Muslims and the Armenians had a great deal in common. They had been educated in the Russian system. If you looked at a picture of a Georgian leader, or a Azeri leader, or an Armenian leader, you really couldn't tell much difference if they dressed more or less the same way as they did. So they had commonalities. They had been through the liberal and socialist school of ideology. They were advocates of democracy. And so one might think that they had enough in common where they would try to make a common stand against the threat of the Turkish aggression. They didn't want to separate from Russia at that time, but they were forced to do so, and they tried to join together in an experiment of having a federation, a Caucasian federation, of Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, all taking in all of the South Caucasus and being a single state with constituent parts. But that experiment did not last. It lasted 1 month because the Turkish armies continued to advance as far as Alexandropol. It seemed like the end of the Armenians was at hand. And at that critical moment, I do not blame them. We can call them, as we do in Armenian historiography, Tavajanner Yavailen, the Georgians, who looked for their own security. And they found their own security by signing a secret treaty with Germany. Germany was the ally of Turkey. And they could, if they quickly sent military forces from the Crimea, which the Germans had already occupied, the Krim, to Poti and other ports, they could then stop the Turkish invasion of Georgia. And so they signed a secret agreement that put their lands under German protection. And the agreement was that they would come out of this Transcaucasian fictional state. They would declare the independence of a Georgian republic. They would raise the German flag along with the Georgian flag, and Georgian units, military units, would rush to the borders of the Tiflis gubernia to stop the Turkish invasion and to direct the Turks southward toward Yerevan. The Turks were going to move somewhere, so let's move them southward. And the Azeris, as the Muslim population, again, quite understandable, were sympathetic with the Turkish invaders because they shared a language, a religion, a culture in many ways. And so, first, the Georgians withdrew from this fictional state known as the Transcaucasian Federation on May 26, 1918. And that was followed a day or two later by the Muslim National Council declaring the independence of Azerbaijan, a name that we had not heard before in the Caucasus, because Azerbaijan, or Azerbaijan for the Armenians at least, was the area of Tabriz. Northern Iran is Azerbaijan. And they came up with this name of Azerbaijan, perhaps because also in Azerbaijan there are Turkic, Azeri kinds of people, and they were looking for maybe a concept of uniting all of these lands under Azerbaijan. In any case, they declared the independence, surprisingly, of a state that had never existed before. And that was the Republic of Azerbaijan, with their temporary capital in Ganjak, Kirovabad. Their temporary capital there, because the Baku, which was the natural capital, was under the control of the Baku Soviet, made up of communists under Stepan Hovhannisyan and under Dashnak military forces. So that in Baku you had an actual coalition of communists and Dashnak military. I mean, these are two political forces that don't like each other, and yet in Baku they collaborated in trying to defend their city from the Turkish invasion. That left the Armenians in a lurch, because now Georgia had declared the independence of their state with the entire Tiflis gubernia, including Lori, Dashet in their republic. The Azerbaijanis declared the independence of their country incorporating Eastern Transcaucasia and Southern Transcaucasia. What does it mean by saying our state is Eastern Transcaucasia and Southern Transcaucasia without defining it? It meant everything. That they had their eyes on everything else that the Georgians didn't want. And it was under those circumstances that in May of 1918, the Armenian National Council in Tiflis debated for 3 days what they should do. And the decision was, we have no other choice but also to declare that we are in control of the Armenian provinces of the Caucasus. And again, they didn't define their state. They didn't define it because it was not a definable state at the time. It was in those days that it seemed that the end of Yerevan was at hand. The Turkish armies had advanced to the gates of Yerevan at Bashabaran in the north and towards Sardarabad in the west. Sardarabad, as you know, is only a few kilometers from Echmiadzin, which is only a few kilometers from Yerevan itself. And if they so chose, probably within a day or two, the Turkish armies would have been in this city. We now lionize the heroic struggle and defense of the Armenians at Sardarabad and Bashabaran. Probably, indeed, we should. Indeed, the Armenians should do that. They, for the first time, were able to stem the Turkish advances. I don't know for how long they could have done so if the Armenians and Turks had not signed this very humiliating Treaty of Batum in June of 1918, in which Turkey recognized a minuscule, a very small Armenian state that became the foundation of the Republic of Armenia, and that included Yerevan, Echmiadzin, and the southern shore of Lake Sevan, an area probably no more than 8 or 10,000 square kilometers in which Armenia was to begin its existence. Simon Baratsian, aside from his very large volume of Hayastani Hanarabeduchun, which was a fundamental source, and really quite...
edition of them?
I'm sorry?
The first edition or the second edition?
The first edition.
Thank you.
1928. Was a fundamental source for the history, and surprisingly quite objective for someone who had been in the government and had been a leader of the Republic. He wrote also 6 volumes of Gyanki Winero, Along Life's Way. And in one of those he describes the Battle of Sardarabad. And he says in Greek classical tragedies, in hopeless situations, there is the intervention of the gods, known as Deus ex machina. And he showed that he claimed that in Sardarabad was Deus ex machina, the unexpected intervention of the gods that brought the Armenian people in there, as he said, Drechavor, and defended and stopped the Turkish invasion and allowed for the creation of this little state. Aram Manukyan, whom you see on the left, was the only major Armenian leader in Yerevan at the time, because the Armenian leadership was still in Tiflis. He is regarded by many people as the real founder of the Republic, because he led the defense there at Sardarabad, along with his military people. And more attention probably has to be given to the regular army under General Zoravar Thomas Nazarabekov, or Nazarabekyan, the other picture, because there had been several regular Armenian divisions or units from the Russian army that had been in Armenia and were very major, probably the fundamental sector of the defense of Sardarabad was under their direction. If you see what the Republic began with in these hash marks, you see all the territories of Russian Armenia, not Turkish Armenia, but Russian Armenia, Eastern Armenia, that were lost in May of 1918. All of the region of Kars and Ardahan, all of the district of Surmalu in the county of the province of Yerevan, with Mount Ararat, Masisa, Araveda Hayastani Mas Cher, Aravela Hayastani Mas Kasmansa, Yerevan Guberniai Nahanki Mas Kasmansa, Yemian Ksant Vaganina, what Pokhvetsav Yevkanats Turkey. So the Republic of Armenia, as you see where I have Republic of Armenia, and compare it with what the Azerbaijanis claimed and controlled most of, and what Georgia had and controlled most of, and this little Armenian Republic started in this territory in an impossible situation. But as we in hindsight, I call it a gift in disguise. It was a gift in disguise. We didn't recognize the importance of it at the time, that it would become the foundation of Armenian hopes and aspirations for a permanent, independent Armenian state. To the east, even after the Armenian state was recognized by Turkey, Armenians and Russians and others still fought for Baku under the leadership of Stepan Shahumyan, a close associate of Lenin, who was later betrayed and sent into Central Asia to be shot, along with other leaders of the Baku Defense Commune. And only in September of 1918, that is 4 months after the establishment of Azerbaijan, did the Turkish armies succeed with the Azeri forces entering Baku, where the last massacre of the Armenians took place on September 14th, 15th, 1918, with some 12,000 more Armenians becoming victims to the Turkish atrocities, and the remaining Armenians fleeing southward toward Enzeli, Resht, into Iran, or to Krasnovodsk, or to Astrakhan in the north. Finally, I'm going to end in shortly to look at the first government of Armenia. It was a question of who should lead. The party Dashnakhtitun had been dominant in Caucasia since the Armeno-Tatar Wars, since the time of the confiscation of the properties of the Armenian Church under time of Khrimian Hayrik. They became very popular, and they won every election there was on a local level. In the Armenian National Council in Tiflis, they also had a very large presence. One of the most respected leaders of the party was Hovhannisyan Kashazmini. And it was decided that he should form the first Armenian government. That also was very difficult. He wanted to have a coalition government of other parties, but those parties did not want to join the government at that time. It was so hopeless. It was so hopeless. So he ended up forming a very small government of a few people, and then the decision was, how do we transfer to, or should we transfer to Yerevan, or should we remain in Tiflis as the Armenian government outside the country? Ultimately, the decision was made, and in July of 1918, now May, June, July, that is 2 months after the declaration of Armenian independence, the First Armenian cabinet took a terrible, dirty little train to Dilijan or Karakilise, or what at that time, and from there by automobile made their way to Yerevan to begin trying to govern a country with thousands of hungry, diseased people and no previous existing real government. That was their challenge. These were the people whom they saw when they arrived in Yerevan, the children, the thousands of orphans everywhere in the streets, beggars and orphans lying in exposed homes. I've been here in winter. You know how cold and freezing and the blizzards and the winds can be, and these poor children lying out exposed on the streets. And you can understand why so many thousands perished in the winter of 1918 and 1919, the first terrible winter in the Armenian Republic. Kevor Kingerort, the Catholicos, had a great outpouring of sympathy and tried to protect as many of these children in Echmiadzin as he could. And I think they called him in Armenian Vishtali, full of sorrow, full of sorrowful Catholicos because of what he saw and witnessed in that year. And finally, in 1918 August, the Armenians decided that they needed to have not only a cabinet government led by Kachaznuni and with Aram Manukyan as the Minister of Interior, but also that they should have a legislative body. It was impossible to have national elections, but the Armenian leaders were committed to the concept of parliamentary government and democratic institutions. So even in those most trying of times, they created the Armenian legislature, which they named Khorurta. And what they did is they took the number of representatives that they had in Tiflis on the Armenian National Council. Tashnatsagan, Jovurtagan, Social Democratner, and they tripled their numbers. So if there were 6 members of the Tashnatshun on the National Council, they became 18 deputies. If there were 3 Jovurtagan, they became 6, and so forth. And that way, the first Armenian legislature was formed. The Speaker of the legislature, the President of the legislature, was again a beloved old revolutionary by the name of Avedik Sahakyan. Gusaksagan Anana Hayr Abrahamer. And Avedik Sahakyan gave really an impressive speech at the opening session. Because in the balcony were seated the German representative, the Austrian representative, the Turkish representatives were sitting up there because they were, the Turkish armies were 6 miles or 10, 12 kilometers away. With their artillery, they could hit Yerevan. They were that close. And even under those conditions, Hayr Abraham made this statement. He reviewed the tragic events that had ended with Declaration of Independence, but he was optimistic. He said, although the Republic was small in size, deprived of its best lands, and unable to provide for all of its citizens, Armenia's boundaries would not remain inflexible forever, that they would not stay in these very constricted few thousand kilometers. History would change that. And he said, I believe that our borders will expand with the iron force of life, with the defense of our just and indisputable rights to the occupied lands. And he's saying this in the presence of the Turkish victors who have taken all these territories, saying, we will not succumb and remain within these narrow boundaries, but our boundaries will expand. And indeed they did, because within 2 months, 3 months after that, Turkey was defeated, the Ottoman Empire was defeated, Germany was defeated by the Allied powers, and the little republic that had started down by Lake Sevan and south of Lake Sevan expanded first by taking the half of the plain of Ararat, which had been occupied by the Turkish armies, and Alexandropol, which had been occupied by the Turkish armies, and expanded farther all into the great fortress city of Kars. And so the first formation of the Armenian Republic had come to fruition with a state that had started with 8,000 square kilometers, now becoming 4 times larger, and giving hope to the refugees that they could return home. And in the first instance, the Armenians who had fled from Alexandropol, who had fled from Kars, who had fled from many of the towns and villages of Kars, were able to return home in the spring of 1919, giving hope to the Turkish Armenians, to the Western Armenians, that Vara, tomorrow, will be our turn when the Allied powers fulfill their promises, fulfill their pledges to rescue the Armenians from the blasting tyranny of the Turks and allow a national, secure future for the Armenian people. And that is how the first phase of the formation, an unexpected creation of an Armenian state. In the unexpected place, Yerevan was not where the Armenians anticipated an autonomous or a free Armenian state. It was Van. It was Garin. That is where the whole concept of the Armenian liberation movement was. But history plays tricks. And here, the trick that was played is that Yerevan, the last expected place, became the capital and remained the capital of the Armenian Republic. Next time, I want to talk about politics, about the formation of the state, about the issues of Western Armenians and Eastern Armenians, about the creation of a coalition government. When the non-Armenian or the non-Dashtun parties saw that there would be possibility of a future for this state, they agreed to join in a coalition government and brought to the Republic a great deal of expertise in economic, judicial, and other matters. Thank you very much for today.
Yes. I forgot to make an announcement. We have a reception in our Akin Gallery, 4th floor in this building. You can go up by the elevators, but maybe would you like to have, we can have conversations with Professor Hovhannisyan there. Would you like to entertain a few questions?
We can do 2
yes.
or 3. I don't think.
Dear Professor, I think that you participate in the Centenary.
I'm not hearing well.
Do we have a microphone? Yes.
Dear Professor, I think you will be in Yerevan second half of May this year.
Yes, I think I will be.
After all the ceremonies, I am inviting you to go the 1st of June to Akhal Kalak, to Sadha. No one mentions this battle of Sadha, where the Armenians stopped the remnants of Turkish army who defeated in Sardarabad and going toward Tbilisi. Fortunately, I participated a few times in these last 10 years. So,
thank you.
Second, do you think what is happening now in the streets of Yerevan is inspire us to achieve what we call it democracy? For me, sir, no. It's a show business badly manipulated by the authorities. As bad show business done in Syria before you, your army, 100 tomahawks never killed anyone, and before that what happened in Duma as chemical weapons.
Yeah.
The last one is the question.
I have no answers for you. Yes, all right, yeah.
Russia donated gas first time to the Turks, but the second time only after 2 years. Who donated gas to Kazim Karabekir army?
I wouldn't call it donated. Unless you call a military collapse. There was a military collapse of the cars, which I'll talk about on Friday. But I think you're referring to the fact that the Armenian army did not defend as they should have defended cars. Is that what you mean?
The government, not the army.
Well, it was the army that fell apart. And then, of course, it was Moscow that put the stamp of approval on giving away cars to Turkey. But these are interesting historical facts, and thank you. Yeah.
Professor, I wanted to ask, I don't know if this is working. In any case, I wanted to ask this, if Armenia was able to expand beyond the borders from when it was established, why didn't they continue toward the sea or toward Mount Ararat and take those territories as well?
What they say it again?
If they were able to expand the territory to Alexandropol, for example, why didn't they continue further?
Because they could not. It was occupied by the Turkish armies, and the Armenian army was not strong enough on its own to expel the Turkish armies from all those areas, and that's what the Allied powers were supposed to do. It was under their watch, and they, of course, demanded the withdrawal, but the Turkish armies under Mustafa Kemal and the resistance movement did not, and so the Armenians were let down. They thought that they would be supported by the victors in World War I, who had made many promises and pledges regarding the restitution and restoration of the Armenian people. But on the Armenia was a small country with refugees and a very small army. Put together, there may have been 20,000 men under arms, not well equipped, and they were fighting on all fronts. They fought in the north. They were fighting. They had to have armed forces in Surmalu. They had to have armed forces toward Nakhichevan border. They had to have armed forces facing Zangezur. They had to have armed forces in Lori. And so the number of troops available for a strong operation to occupy this vast area was beyond the capability of the Armenians at the time. And without external support, that would not happen. And ultimately it did not happen. And that's why those territories remain beyond the borders. There was no way that they could take them. The Armenian population had been destroyed in that area. There was no base, national base of support from the local population of an Armenian army coming in because there were no Armenians left there.
I think given the time, we should...
Well, we have one person standing. Let's do that.
Sorry. I don't even know how to formalize the question, but first of all, thank you very much for today's lecture. I've never been gripped so intently and haven't even checked my phone for once. So thank you very much. The question of the elite, you often talked about in your speech about in Tbilisi, the Armenian political elite playing a key role in the entire process of the formation of the First Republic. Is there a similar story about the Armenian political intellectual elite in Istanbul? And often the sense that one gets is that there is disdain, may be a word, kind of the rural areas of Armenia were not seen as part of. What about that? And then how do these imperial powers, how do they use this elite to control the regions? Well, because I think that continues to
it's somewhat ironic but true that the major centers of Armenian life in both Western and Eastern Armenia were outside the historic Armenian homelands. Cultural center, economic center, political centers had grown up in one instance, the capital of the Caucasus, where the namestnik or the viceroy of the Caucasus was, in Tiflis. The major city remains a remarkably beautiful and wonderful city. And so all of the Armenians felt very much at home there. When you're part of the Russian Empire, it doesn't make too much difference in that you feel comfortable where you are. I mean, these people have connections everywhere. There's a network. And I experienced this as a student when I went to Beirut. I returned to California the opposite direction through Asia. And I stopped in 20 different communities, and everywhere I knew Armenians, or found Armenians, and they told me who the next Armenians were in the next community. And so this network, and so the Tiflis Armenians felt very, very comfortable where they were. They could, they had networks in Moscow and Rostov, Nakhichevan, in Baku, and so forth. And the same is true in Constantinople, which was a secure city, which was a Europeanized, relatively Europeanized city, very different from the country bumpkins. Unfortunately, historical Armenian lands, both in Eastern Armenia and in Western Armenia, had become ruralized. No major cities existed anymore. We talk about Ani. Ani was a huge medieval city, but there were no cities like that left in the 18th and 19th century. The largest of these were Van and Erzurum, Vrishpanchikar. And these were not advanced cities at all. They were living in cultural backwardness. But one of the things that we must say also is that the move and push of the Armenians to achieve enlightenment and cultural immediately separated them in the Ottoman Empire from their Muslim neighbors and became certainly one of the causes for envy and differentiation that would also contribute to the Armenian genocide. So Bolis absolutely is the Western Armenian Tiflis, and yes, the authorities work through the elites to control their people. They work through the Patriarchate, and in the Persian times here, they work through the Catholicos of Echmiadzin to gain the sympathy and obedience and taxation of their people. The elites profit from this. The Tiflis elites profit from this as well. And so there is this divide between elite and the common people, even though we find out that ultimately the elites are the ones also who become the reformers and the spokespeople for change and reform within the system. Thank you very much.
So Wednesday will be the second lecture at 6:30 here.